Males of the golden-collared manakin perform elaborate courtship displays that are very complicated. They're very fast, they make these elaborate noises, and it requires a careful balance of hormones and musculature and behavior and timing and mate choice. Behavior is a complicated question. When you're actually trying to study animal behavior, we need to realize that a behavior is an action carried out by muscles under the control of the nervous system in response to a stimuli. And this is responsible for things like nutrient acquisition and sexual reproduction. And all of an animal's physiology will contribute to its behavior, while its behavior will influence all of its physiology. It's essential for these processes, and it is subject to substantial selective pressure during evolution, acting on anatomy through body form, contributing through recognition and communication, and all of these structures that underlie behavior. Overall, behavior is going to start by some sort of recognition of stimuli, some sort of communication will be passed, but it's all going to be coming back to that concept that was mentioned on the first slide, the ultimate and the proximate causation. The ultimate causation of a behavior is why does a behavior occur, especially in the context of natural selection. And the proximate causation is how does a behavior occur. Okay, so when a stimulus has been received, really what you're looking at is signaling. Signaling functions in communication, and animals will generate environmental stimuli that guide other animals' behaviors. Okay, a stimulus transmitted is a signal, and then transmission and reception would be communication. Courtship behavior, like with the mannequins, would be an example of this. Okay, even something like a fruit fly has fairly elaborate courtships with stimuli response chains through this whole series of reactions. Honeybees use symbolic language to share information about the location of food sources. They dance in a round dance, the round dance in tight circles. That's going to tell them if there is food close to the hive. And that's going to motivate follower bees to leave the hive and search for food nearby. But when it's further away, they do a waggle dance consisting of a half circle swing in one direction, and then a straight run, and a half circle swing in the other direction. The angle of the run relative to the hive is the same angle as to the sun. So basically, bees are doing trig, geometry, I don't know. Okay, but communication doesn't have to be physical. It could be auditory, like the sounds of the cricket. It could be chemical, like alarm pheromones released by fish whenever there's a predator or when another fish is injured. Okay, anything that is going to be signal, received, and maybe response is going to be part of this communication behavior. Orientation behaviors are one that we're going to study in our actual lab. The plants that we looked at, they responded to light, they oriented themselves, but it was more of a tropic response. They grew towards or they grew away from. Animals can move, they're motile. So we have two different types of orientation behaviors, and we typically study these things in something like a choice chamber over on the right. You give the organism different environments and you examine their preferences over time. Taxis and kinesis are these two major ideas. Kinesis is going to be a change in the rate of movement in response to a stimuli. So roly-poly, woodlouse, sowbug, whatever you want to call it, it's more active in dry areas and less active in humid areas. It turns out that they have tiny little gills because they're related to like crab species. And so when they encounter moist areas, they tend to stay there as it's a preferred environment. Whereas taxis is going to be directional movement. So Euglena, for example, has a positive phototaxis. They move towards the light. And it makes sense because they're photosynthetic and they have flagella, they can move, and through that structure. So in the picture 2 here, I think it's supposed to be tinfoil, but you get that positive taxis moving towards a stimuli, or you could have negative taxis moving away from a stimuli. All of that's going to combine together. The stimuli could be anything, like so phototaxis is light, say geotaxis would be obviously gravity, thigmotaxis would be touch, rheotaxis is chemical pollutants and concentration, all sorts of different terms that they could give you within the broader subject.
For many behaviors, all individuals in a population exhibit virtually the same behavior despite internal differences and environmental differences during development and throughout life. And these are called innate behaviors. Okay, they are naturally occurring. No one teaches the baby dolphin how to swim, or the spider how to spin a web, or the butterfly and moth how to make a cocoon, but that behavior is encoded into their very being. Okay, some of the most simple innate behaviors are the so-called fixed action patterns. And a fixed action pattern is a sequence of acts directly linked to a simple stimulus. Okay, a great example of this is the male stickleback fish. You can see a diagram of them on the left. The males have a red bottom. Okay, so what happened was that they would put different objects near the male's nesting territory, and if it had a red base, the male would attack it regardless of size or shape. It didn't matter if it was another fish or anything different. Okay, goslings and gray geese, for example, will roll egg-shaped objects into their nests as an automatic behavior, even if it's the size of a volleyball. Okay, the only human behavior that is undeniably innate are reflex behaviors, several of which occur in infants, like the grasping reflex, or maybe the reflex when the doctor hits your knee. Those would be innate to your very self.
Is a change in behavior that occurs as a result of experience. Compared with innate behavior, learned behaviors are less rigid and they can be modified to suit changing systems. Imprinting, for example, enables the young to discriminate the members of their own species, and it's vital for reproductive success. And that only occurs during a very limited time in development. And we've had to use that imprinting things to, say, for example, teach orphaned cranes how to follow migration paths, the scientists on the top. Uh, Habituation is falling under sort of a similar category. It's one of the simplest forms of learning. It's a loss of responsiveness to stimuli that convey little to no new information. So basically, boy who cried wolf, right? So you get used to that alarm and you stop paying attention. That would be part of that process. Some animals are also capable of spatial learning, where the environment with sort of spatial variation is part of that memory response. The wasp here, for example, is a ground wasp, and they use physical landmarks in order to remember the locations of their nest. So in the experiment, they put pine cones around the nest, and then when they moved the pine cones, the wasp could no longer find its burrow. So it's part of that process. It's the same thing like when you learn how to like get places based off of landmarks, and then the landmarks change, you're confused. So was the wasp. Learned behaviors can be more complicated. Uh, Association learning, that's going to be connecting sort of that knowledge, the ability to associate one environmental feature, such as a color, for example, with another, such as a foul taste. So birds learn to avoid monarch butterflies because they taste bad and they're slightly toxic. Okay, that's going to be connected to some of the ideas of conditioning, both classical and operant conditioning. With classical condition, you have an arbitrary stimulus that becomes associated with a particular outcome, Pavlov's dog, for example. And then in operant conditioning, that's trial and error learning, you associate one of your behaviors with a reward or a punishment. That would be more like Skinner. Okay. Associative learning studies reveal that the ability of animals to link circumstances and stimuli has limits, and the association readily affects sort of situations, relationships that are likely to appear in nature. Development of some behaviors, such as singing in bird species, occurs in distinct stages. They learn from those around them through that sensitive period. Many animals can learn to solve problems by observing the behaviors in others, and that sort of connects into the broader social learning. Vervet monkeys, for example, you can see here, they teach each other how to use tools and how to open food items. You have alarm call responses. Lots of different information can happen there. Cultural transfer of information has the potential to alter behavioral phenotypes and influence the individual fitness, which is really one major reason why human populations became dominant, because of shared social learning and culture. More complicated behaviors are going to fall into the realm of cognition, the process of knowing represented by awareness, reasoning, recollection, and cognition. In one experiment, for example, honeybees exposed to a sample color were rewarded for flying into the arm of a Y-shaped maze marked with the same color or a different color. And after repeated trials, they tried it again with same and different patterns instead of colors, and the bees were still able to understand that. They understood same versus different. Problem solving, like problem solving with a chimp or a crow or something like that, would be advanced levels of cognition and one of the more complicated types of behavior.
One question is, are behaviors linked to your genetics? Well, in some cases, it seems to be the answer is yes. Insect calls, for example, there are many species of the green lacewing you can see here that are morphologically identical, and when they hybridize, they end up with a hybrid song with characteristics of both parents. Migration is another one. Young black-capped birds captured in Britain and raised in Germany. The birds from Britain demonstrated a migratory preference different from the native German blackwing or black-cap birds. Okay, genetic analyses and inclusive fitness and all of these questions led to a lot of interesting studies here. One that I find interesting is in fruit flies. Males have a gene called FRU, which stands for fruitless. And if you remove the FRU gene from the male, it fails to court and mate with the females. Normal males and females form distinct forms of this gene, and when you manipulate a female to have the male form of the gene, they court other females just as a male does. How can a single gene control so many behaviors? It's a master regulatory gene that programs these behaviors. So can behavior be considered genetic? Yes. But what about other factors like the way that you're raised, the environment that you live in? Is it nature or is it nurture?
Some changes are going to be environmental. Foraging behavior, for example, is not only eating, but also sort of searching for, recognizing, and capturing food. And organisms are going to spend as little energy as possible, basically. So optimal foraging theory views foraging as a compromise between the benefits of nutrition and the costs of obtaining food. So the preferred height is going to give you that advantage there. There's going to be environmental constraints. Cross-fostering studies with animals showed that the more aggressive species, if raised by non-aggressive species, would have reduced aggression. So we're saying, is behavior nature? Yeah. Is behavior nurture? Yeah, it's both. They're both connected here. Environmental conditions can influence behavior through learning, the modification of behaviors based on specific experiences, and we've even done this with humans if you look at twin studies. They're not as common because it's hard to have sort of twins that are raised in different environments, but it is possible to find. Some behaviors are going to be connected directly to reproductive behaviors, fitness, for example. Some behaviors, more physical behaviors. If you look at sort of the structures of males and females, if the males and females are very similar to each other, they're likely to be a monogamous species. If the males are more elaborate, it tends to be a polygynous species, polygamy, one male with multiple females. And if the female is more elaborate, then it tends to be polyandrous. Think something, a better example than the picture here would be something like black widow spiders, for example. Okay. Other behaviors are going to be sort of within the gender, so like agonistic interactions. That's going to be when males fight each other, or sometimes even females fight each other for the right to reproduce and control processes. Uh, it happens. Okay, a good example of a study of sexual selection influencing behavior is finches. So what they did was they basically glued a false crest onto the parents in the different combinations. And what they found overall was a mate choice copying. Basically, it's a behavior in which an individual copies the mate choice of others or of a parent. So basically, the female finches were more likely to choose males to mate with that looked like their father. So imprinting structures are going on there. Some species with that mate choice copying, basically the male is only going to be chosen if another female chooses him first. It gets complicated. Another factor here with behavior is parental care. The needs of the young are an important factor that constrains evolution of mating systems. With most, for example, newly hatched birds, they can't care for themselves and they require a large and continuous food supply that a single parent has a difficulty surviving. Birds with young that can feed and care for themselves have less need for parents to stay together. And this is going to influence not only the parent's survival, but the number of eggs that will survive in a brood. So there's different types of parental care that exist. Maternal and paternal are pretty self-explanatory. Biparental is both parents. And then the alloparental is this broader sort of, it takes a village sort of thing. We do find that the most common reasons for something like paternal care is certainty of paternity. Since certainty of paternity is much higher in species that engage in external fertilization, when egg laying and mating occur together, male parental care is much more likely. Overall, we find that males tend to sort of involve themselves in care, prevalent when you have sort of advantages. Okay, there's sort of the mating effort hypothesis suggests that males provide care for offspring in an attempt to increase their own mating opportunities. And then there's also the maternal relief hypothesis proposing that males provide care to reduce the burdens of the female, ultimately generating shorter interbirth intervals. So all sorts of common sort of situations there. Biparental care tends to be favored when sexual selection is not super intense and when the adult sex ratio is not strongly skewed. And alloparental care, while seemingly altruistic and reproductively costly because you're doing all of that sort of investment, there are sort of overall benefits there. But think like a bee or an ant hive or ground squirrels, for example. Alloparental is beneficial because it promotes earlier weaning. There's frequency of care. There's more protection. They can spread out those resource costs. So we see a variety of parental care types that occur in nature. Part of that altruistic alloparental structure looks at this idea of behavior as a more complicated benefit. Most social behaviors are actually selfish. They benefit the individual at the expense of the competitors. And basically, behaviors that maximize survival and reproductive success are favored by selection. So why does altruism make sense? Well, altruism is a behavior that decreases individuals' fitness, but increases the fitness of other individuals in the population. Ground squirrels, for example, are very likely to call for sort of alarm calls whenever there is a predator. That alarm calling squirrel is more likely to be eaten, okay, and so there is a cost. And we find that females are much more likely to do these calls, but they're also much less likely to move away from the place of their birth. So it turns out that there is a connection there to the survival not only of the individual, but also of the family and of their genes. From this, they sort of extracted, and other examples, they extracted this idea of inclusive fitness, and it's defined as the total effect an individual has on proliferating its own genes by reproducing and by helping close relatives reproduce. And they turn this into a formula called kin selection. RB is greater than C. When relatedness times benefit is greater than the cost to the organism, then a trait will be selected for. This rule is a natural selection factor, and the more closely related two individuals are, the greater the value of altruism. Siblings, for example, have an R of 0.5, but between an aunt and her niece, it's an R of 0.25, and between first cousins, it's 0.125. At this degree of relatedness decreases, that inequality decreases. Okay. Now, other behaviors exist that are part of this idea, and there's a couple of different factors. So the kin selection factor is going to be part of that balance, but we also see this reciprocal altruism as well. Reciprocal altruism is limited to species with stable social groups, but basically organisms are likely to behave altruistically to others who are not close relatives when it is likely that that behavior will be returned. It's because cheating provides a large benefit to the cheaters. Researchers have questioned this concept, and really it connects to game theory. Individuals are always altruistic or cooperative on the first encounter and remain so as long as their altruism is reciprocated. When it is not reciprocated, an individual will retaliate immediately, but then return to cooperative behavior as soon as the other individual becomes cooperative. So it gets really complicated. This broader field leads into an entire unit of structure called sociobiology, and that's connected to culture and capacity for learning and evolutionary history, and it's definitely an interesting field when you get into it.